so let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Jen Tyson from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Department of Justice Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and my co-presenters, who I'll introduce in just a second, we wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, the Introduction to the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court Guidelines. Thanks so much for joining us. As Jessica noted, this is the first in a series of 3 webinars, and we hope to accomplish 3 basic goals today. The first is to provide a brief background for and describe the goals of the newly released guidelines. The second is to briefly introduce the key material and content of the guidelines, and I say briefly because the next 2 webinars are broken up into 2 parts, and those will be the much more in-depth webinars about each of the guidelines. And so today we want to sort of make sure everyone's more familiar with the guidelines, sort of what they include, but then the next 2 webinars will be the more in-depth about sort of the statements and the underlying sort of research and some of the practice components related. And the third is to provide you resources to continue to learn more about the guidelines, including a website that houses a lot of information sort of behind the guidelines, as well as the guidelines themselves. So we do still have a lot to cover, even though it's an introduction. So let's jump in with introductions. So first, I'm Jennifer Tyson. I'm the research coordinator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention with the research unit there. And throughout the life of this initiative, I've also served as the project officer, so I've worked very closely with our team of individuals. And so second, we have Roger Jarjora, he's a principal researcher with the American Institutes for Research and is the project director for this initiative. There is also Lynetta Jesse on the phone, who is my colleague in OJJDP, and she's a program manager and the project officer for the training and technical assistance and the programmatic initiatives related to Juvenile Drug Treatment Court in our OJJDP, and you heard from, at the beginning, Jessica Pierce, who's with NCJ FCJ and provides specialized training and technical assistance to juvenile drug treatment courts and has been a close partner throughout the entire initiative. In addition, while they're not speaking today, I did want to also acknowledge that we have representatives from American University and the National Association of Drug Court Professionals on the phone who have begun a new training and technical assistance project with OJJDP and will be working with courts throughout the country on the implementation of the guidelines. And finally, I also want to say that while there's a few of us presenting today, we've had the honor of working with colleagues across the federal government, a number of academic institutions, a number of courts, experts, families, and youth throughout this entire process. We plan to continue to partner with them as the implementation continues, and so while time prevents us from introducing each and every one of them, the guidelines, the document itself includes an acknowledgement section to each of their thoughtful contributions, and so I did want to acknowledge sort of how important and lucky we have been to be able to work with such a diverse group of people. So with that, I will start to give a little bit of background. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on sort of where this initiative started sort of for our office, and then Roger will give more of the in-depth review of the content itself. So OJJDP had the privilege of releasing the new Juvenile Drug Treatment Court Guidelines at the end of 2016. It was a 2-year effort built upon that sort of amazing federal research practice collaborative that I just described, and working with a number of partners. They're posted along with an interactive map and background and references, resources, and other materials at this website that you can see on your screen now. So it's on ojjdp.gov. If you just, sort of copy down that link, or if you just Google that address, you should be able to get there. Very briefly, the guidelines are treatment-oriented. We think this is reflected in the emphasis on sort of evidence-based treatment throughout the guidelines, as well as identifying a variety of mental health, substance use, and criminogenic needs in the guidelines. But one thing I wanted to sort of highlight that's been important for our office is also in the name. The use of the T here, treatment, in juvenile drug treatment courts is actually a new sort of effort for OJJDP. We had historically called this type of work juvenile drug court. And the sort of addition of the T is really reflective of the orientation of our office and also of the guidelines to that sort of treatment aspect of this approach. Second, I wanted to highlight that the guidelines and sort of an underlying principle behind them is that they're evidence-based. The administrator of OJJDP under this initiative was Bob Listenby, and so he was committed to ensure that these guidelines were founded and grounded in research. So as a reflection of the commitment, this initiative was managed out of the research unit, and it also includes a testing phase, a sort of research phase that we're just beginning now. But they are based on rigorous research about what has been shown to be associated with the greatest reductions in recidivism and offending behaviors of youth. And they're really, that evidence base, the sort of, goals behind it is to be as supportive as possible of juvenile courts that have the sort of hard work of working with youth every day to sort of highlight that these types of actions, have been shown by research, these types of practices have been shown by research to likely have the impact that you're intending to have. And then the last is that they're really guided by that sort of the research in adolescent development and sort of a framework of family engagement. They integrate it sort of throughout with research and theory, but this is, this is somewhat how juvenile courts and juvenile drug treatment courts in particular are, obviously unique from some adult approaches. And so, that they're focused on the adolescent, right? And an adolescent is still developing his sort of individual and his cognitive, emotional, social functioning. And so really sort of gearing all of the presentation and the information towards that sort of developmental perspective is interwoven throughout the guidelines. And then, related to that, the role of the family, right, with youth, with adolescents, there's obviously a strong role and a strong need for family, and so indicating throughout the guidelines sort of how families are engaged and what the role is in this process. So as we present more information sort of about the content of the guidelines, the underlying research, I hope how each of these principles are integrated will become more and more apparent, but I did want to highlight that up front. So how we got here. This started as an initiative for our office to develop and test juvenile drug treatment court guidelines. It was started in 2014 in sort of the formal way via competitively awarded cooperative agreement to the American Institutes for Research. As I noted at the beginning, and through that agreement, AIR and our office are partnering and sort of collaborating with and have formal agreements with a number of other researchers, experts, and federal agencies. So it was designed as a two-phase project over a 5-year initiative. Phase 1, as I noted, consists of developing and releasing the guidelines. And so we've now concluded phase 1, and we're starting on phase 2, which is actually the testing phase. And so that will be the next 3 years, and it's focused on implementation and testing of the guidelines. Prior to this formal launch, there had been a series of listening sessions and conversations and scans of research that led to this initiative, and so I will now cover a little bit of that background. Okay, so what led to the development of the guidelines? There are basically two related paths of research and expertise that led to this initiative. The first is the broader research about adolescents and substance use. About adolescent substance use and how youth with SUDs first come into contact with the juvenile justice system. So as I think many people on the phone know, there is, a very high prevalence of youth and adolescents with substance use disorders across the country. And so, based on estimates by SAMHSA, it's estimated that 1 in 5 adolescents have substance use disorders in 2014. And so that's when this initiative started. And then we also know that youth with substance use disorders often come into contact with juvenile courts. In 2013, there were 13% of the delinquency cases in juvenile courts involved a drug charge as the most serious offense. But substance use disorders are also prevalent among youth involved in the juvenile justice system. Even if it's not the most serious offense, it is still something that our office recognizes as prevalent and a need to sort of respond to. Our office has also sort of recognized the, I think we're indicating that there is some concern with the audio. I want to pause for 1 second and check with Jessica. Are we having any audio trouble? Jessica? Okay, I'm going to pause 1 second. Okay, I'm going to ask, so Lynetta or Roger, can you hear me?
Jen, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'll continue. I think then we might have lost our host, but I think everyone else can hear. Okay, so our office also recognizes that formal juvenile court processing can sometimes exacerbate the negative behaviors instead of improving the outcomes. And so all of this research was really the sort of background and the basis for the project and sort of why we, recognizing that the need that there of substance use disorders and sort of how that these youth are coming into contact with the juvenile courts, it's a sort of, it's a widespread need across the country, which I know many of the individuals on the phone sort of already aware of all these statistics and this background. So what specifically led to the development of the guidelines? So this is really now talking about the research on the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. And so again, I think a number of individuals are sort of aware of this background. But beginning in the 1990s, to address the problem of justice-involved use of substance use disorders, I think many people know that the adult drug court models were adapted for juveniles by placing an emphasis more on the family-based and developmentally appropriate services. And so in 2003, I think, again, probably most people on the phone know this, that there was a sort of, I would say, seminal document that was released, the Juvenile Drug Court Strategies and Practice. It was developed by an expert consensus to serve as a framework for planning, implementing, and operating a juvenile drug court. But one of the biggest questions that sort of has come up is that sort of basic, as the research shown, that have juvenile drug courts worked. So overall, I think in summary, the evaluations regarding the effectiveness of juvenile drug courts have been inconclusive. In other words, there's been a lack of rigorous research about the sort of juvenile drug courts, as well as a lack of sort of consistency in how juvenile drug courts are implemented and how they're sort of what the model is. And so I think, just to emphasize this point, because this sort of serves as the background, that it was one of the sort of most complex parts of the background of this project, was trying to, address sort of what is the research said to date about juvenile drug courts. And we held a series of listening sessions at OJGDP, and this was a question that, there were many very mixed feelings about, and mixed, just a lot of passion around whether or not juvenile drug courts had worked and what the research said. And so this really just emphasizes that it's been inconclusive to date, and that's what our office, served as the background for this initiative. So, phase one, what we did was to take all of this research and to figure out a process for how do we get from this research on what we know has worked to sort of looking towards how do you develop guidelines. And in this process, how do you operationalize it, and how do you not lose sight of the importance of, making sure that whatever comes out, that they're actionable, that they're practical, and that they can systematically incorporate expert feedback, and you know, perspectives from researchers, courts, and service providers, and youth and families. And so how we sort of did that, I'm not going to really get into too much here about what this represents, was to develop what we call a research, evidence, and practice synthesis and translation protocol. And so what the protocol is supposed to do is really, and it's available on the website, and again, Roger will point to where, it just sort of walks through the steps on sort of how research was used, how that sort of was synthesized, how that was then translated into the guidelines, how expert opinion was brought in, and how that sort of all resulted in the different aspects of the final guidelines. So the last sort of slide before I transfer to Roger I'll highlight here is that there are different types of information on the guidelines. And again, I'm mostly presenting this just for a sense of sort of the underlying components of the guidelines. But the guidelines include both, you know, different sort of a map, guideline statements, there's contextual information. And so the one part, and there's each different components of that protocol, that translation process, get translated to different parts of this in different ways. The one thing I will emphasize is the guideline statements. That is sort of the emphasis on the research, the evidence-based, and that is where there was the highest standard around research. And so that is the core, you know, content here. That's what Roger's going to focus on when he presents. And so that is the sort of the strongest evidence for the whole guidelines. So with that, I'm going to pause for a few minutes to see if there are any questions. And just as a reminder, as Jessica noted, if you do have any questions, can you please type them into the Q&A? And so I will see if, I think Jessica has rejoined us to see if there's any questions.
Yes, ma'am, I am back. I apologize. Sometimes technology works fabulously, and sometimes we have a few challenges. I have a couple of questions that have come in, but I think that maybe they're going to be answered when Roger is doing his piece, so I want to hold those back a little bit. If you do have questions about the history or the reason that OJJDP made these choices, this would be a great time to ask Jen. I mean, how often do you get to ask OJJDP why they did something? All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions coming in, so if you want to transition over to Roger, I think that's perfect.
Great, sure. So Roger, I will turn it over to you to give the sort of the core of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Jen. And as Jessica and Jen have already mentioned, so I'm really going to give you just a brief introduction to each of the guideline statements. We will talk about each of them, but we're going to get through all of them, and so it will be rather brief. We will plan to come back in the next two webinars to talk in more detail about them. And certainly, I did notice that there were a significant number of people that are on the call that have already read the guidelines, so you've already been introduced to them as well. So this image that you're seeing is the map of the guidelines. And so this was our attempt to try to show with a graphic sort of the organization of the full set of guidelines here. And so what you're looking at here, so the guidelines are organized within 7 objectives. And so the bars going across that are numbered 1 through 7, those are the objectives. Those are the overarching objectives of the guidelines themselves. And then within each objective, then there are a number of guideline statements, and those are numbered as, you know, connected to the objective. So under objective 1, we've got guideline statement 1.1 up to guideline statement 1.6. You'll also see that in the upper right-hand corner of the map is the set of the outcomes that we were looking at in terms of the guideline statements themselves, right? And so the guideline statements are intended to be research informed to the extent that research shows that these particular practices are related to the outcomes that you see in the JDTC outcomes section there. We don't have specific guidelines that say more about the outcomes other than just really to let you understand that the context here in which we were working on what had to do with those as the particular outcomes. And you'll notice also as well that the outcomes include reducing subsequent delinquent involvement and subsequent use of substances, but also the healthy adolescent development outcomes too. We see those as equally important as outcomes for the juvenile drug treatment courts. So I want to just say a few things about the overall set of guidelines and objectives first, again, to just kind of put a frame here. And I think it's helpful for folks to understand what the guidelines are and are not. So as I just mentioned, so we were really interested in making sure that these were all grounded in research, but research that showed effects on the particular outcomes that we were interested in. So that was one of the defining characteristics of the research, is whether these practices are shown in the research to be connected to the particular outcomes that we looked at. So there may be other research informed aspects of your practice that you're aware of, but if we couldn't connect them with high quality research to the outcomes that we were focused on, then that may be a reason why there's not a guideline statement to that effect. Also, there are a number of guideline statements, so you'll get a feel if you've already looked, you know that there are many guideline statements, and we did this on purpose because we took care to make sure that each one focused on a single aspect. So I'll just give you an example. One of the guideline statements is that youth should be referred to treatment that is evidence-based, an evidence-based treatment approach, and there's a number of those, right, that are that one of the meta-analyses that our team did pointed to. Another guideline statement is that if the evidence-based treatment is being provided by a local provider, that they're providing it, that they're administering it with fidelity to the original model, to the theoretical model of the treatment. So it is plausible, right, that you might refer a young person to treatment but the treatment isn't well implemented. So we thought it was important to make sure that those were two separate guidelines, even though there's a relationship there and they're both under the same objective. So that's why there's a number of the guideline statements. The third thing I just want to point out is that so one of the things that was clear in the research is that we were looking at evidence that suggested that these practices were effective in processing youth with substance use disorders, and so not necessarily tied to the structure of a juvenile drug treatment court, but so we believe that many of the guidelines would be applicable to processing these youth with substance use disorders in a traditional juvenile court. So there's nothing about the guidelines that precludes that, and we would welcome folks to consider those practices with that population. And then the last thing, you will probably think of aspects of your work that are not explicitly addressed by the guidelines. And that can happen for a couple of reasons. We had a pretty high standard of what the evidence needed to be in order for something to be a guideline statement. And so there are some questions. There are questions that have come up when I've been talking with groups in the past that we just didn't have the research that would be necessary to say in a guideline statement. So for instance, we don't have a guideline statement that addresses the question, how many times a week should drug testing happen? We just couldn't put our fingers on any research that really clarified that particular question. So the guidelines talk about having a drug testing protocol, but doesn't get to that level of detail. So there will be other things like that too. Now I'll mention a little bit about our plans for testing the guidelines in this next phase, and you'll see that. And one of our hopes is that we might be able to shed light on some of these questions that the research at this point is not doesn't help clarify too. And so we'll be paying attention as questions come up, as people ask us about practices that you feel like are not addressed to the level that you're hoping in the guidelines, and perhaps those are things that we'll learn more about in the next couple of years that we can come back and revisit at the end of the testing phase when we'll consider revising the guidelines. All right, so let's talk about, I'm just going to walk through the entire set of guidelines here, and I'll try to go at a pretty deliberate pace so that I can get through all of them, and then we'll have time. We're going to go out and look at the website too and show you how to use the resources that we have there. So the first objective is that the focus, the JDTC philosophy and practice on effectively addressing substance use and criminogenic needs with the focus on decreasing future offending and substance use and to increase positive outcomes. Again, so that's just a reminder that we really are focusing on those three big groups of outcomes here. And so the items, the guideline statements that come under Objective 1 further this objective. So there are a set of guidelines. So Guideline 1.1 is that the JDTC team should be composed of stakeholders that are committed to the philosophy and practice of the court and to ongoing program and system improvement. And again, that the research pointed to those as important characteristics within the practice and the philosophy of the team. The team should also include relationships that are collaborative with community partners that are going to be important for thinking about the young person holistically. Guideline 1.2 really speaks to making sure that the roles for each member of the team should be clearly articulated. Guideline 1.3 is that the team should include participants from the local school systems and that the goal should be overcoming the educational barriers that the participants of your program face. Now, one of the things I'll just mention, and I'll show you this when we go out to the website too. So if you go into the actual the manuscript itself, you'll be able to see that for each one of these guideline statements, we have a section of the report that's dedicated to presenting to you the research evidence that was the basis for this statement, but also then a section that really addresses practice considerations that arose from some of the work that we did along the way, but also a lot of the feedback that we got from some of the reviewers of the guidelines while they were being developed. So for each one of these, there will be a section of the report that really goes into more detail, and you'll find that useful as you think about how do I apply this in my own setting? Are we already doing this? Guideline 1.4 is that the court should ensure that all team members have equal access to high quality regular training and technical assistance, with a focus on improving staff capacity to operate the court and deliver the related programming effectively. And if you go to this guideline, you'll be able to see we have a list of the topics we think are the key ones that should be required, right, to provide. And you'll also find some information there about how to access the training and technical assistance that is already available nationally, and many of it through the OJJDP funded centers. Guideline 1.5, the JDTC should be deliberate about engaging parents and guardians throughout the court process, which includes addressing the specific barriers to their full engagement. And so there's content in there that really speaks to helping to ensure that transportation, if that's a barrier, gets addressed, the timing of the court hearings, really doing what we can to make sure that they're engaged throughout the entire process. And then the last guideline under Objective 1, 1.6, is that the courts should provide court-certified or licensed on-site interpreters for parents or guardians that have limited English proficiency and for those with a hearing deficiency as well. In addition, any documents that you're providing should be translated into the native language for youth and parents and guardians that English is not their native language. Okay, so then objective 2 is really focused on ensuring equitable treatment for all youth by adhering to eligibility criteria and conducting appropriate screening. There are 5 guidelines under this objective. Guideline 2.1 sets out the eligibility criteria, right, which comes from, and this was from a careful review of the research, kids that are served by your courts should meet these requirements here, right? That they have a substance use disorder, and if you there's several places in the guidelines that really look at what does that mean. There's a substance use disorder. How do you screen for that? How do you assess for that? They should be at least 14 years or older and should have a moderate to high risk of reoffending. So we're recommending that these should be the youth that are served by your court. And we address in the guidelines too, so what happens if you have a young person who has a substance use disorder, is moderate to high risk of reoffending, but is 13 years old. And so there's some information in there about the things that you can consider. The research did suggest, though, that the way that juvenile drug treatment courts are organized to work with, which includes the contingency management, right, the use of the incentives and the sanctions, that just works better. That kids who are 14 and older generally have better capacity to benefit from that kind of an approach. But it's something that you could consider on a case-by-case basis, and so we suggest things that you might take into account if you're faced with that kind of a scenario. 2.2, assess all program participants for the risk of reoffending using a validated instrument. In 2.3, it talks about screening for substance use, again, using validated and culturally responsive assessments. And we provide you with some links to some good examples of validated instruments for risk and substance use disorder. Guideline 2.4 addresses the question of what happens if you've got participants that either do not have a substance use disorder and are not assessed as moderate to high risk for reoffending. The recommendation is they should be diverted from your process, from the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court process. Doesn't mean they wouldn't be served in juvenile court, but they're probably not well suited to benefit from a court that would be organized consistent with the guidelines. And then guideline 2.5 is to ensure that eligibility criteria result in equity of access for all genders, racial and ethnic groups, and youth who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, intersex, and gender nonconforming, and two-spirit. All right, so that brings us to objective 3, which is to provide a court process that engages the full team and follows procedures fairly. And we've got 4 guidelines under objective 3. Number 1, the JDTCs should work collaboratively with parents and guardians throughout the court process to encourage active participation. So active participation on the part of the parents and the guardians in regular court hearings, in the supervision and discipline of their children in the home and community, and in treatment programs as well. So all of those would be important to meet this guideline. And then guideline 3.2, the judge should interact with the participants in a manner that is seen as being non-judgmental and procedurally fair. 3.3, the judge should be consistent when applying program requirements, which includes here the incentives and sanctions. And guideline 3.4, the team should meet weekly to review progress for participants and consider incentives and sanctions based on the reports of each participant's progress across all aspects of the treatment plan. And that speaks to the participation of all the team members too in providing the content, right, for that review. Objective 4 looks at conducting comprehensive needs assessments that inform individualized case management. And so here it's really looking at how do you gather all the information that you're going to need in order to really have the most effective treatment plans and then case management systems. So Guideline 4.1, there's two guideline statements here, 4.1 and 4.2, but 4.1 is a big one. And so what we tried to do here is think about all the different ways that the research suggests we should be doing these assessments, right? These comprehensive assessments. So when you go out on the website, you'll see what's on the right-hand side of this slide here. So under 4.1, there are 6 different areas that needs assessments should be done on. And so if you click on any of the 6 of these, and I'll show you when we go out there how each of these buttons is supposed to be content that you can click and open up and learn more about. So it really breaks down each of the 6 areas here into separate discussions here. But all of them are different ways that needs assessments should be conducted, again, towards the beginning of the process. And then guideline 4.2 is that your case management and treatment plans should be individualized and culturally appropriate and based on and an assessment of the youth's needs and the family's needs too. And you'll see that that was one of the areas in 4.1 is that you're also assessing parental drug use, parental mental health needs, and parenting skills as well. All right, so then objective 5 is the implementation of the contingency management, case management, and community supervision strategies in an effective manner. And under objective 5, we have guideline 5.1 is that for each participant, the application of incentives should equal or exceed the sanctions that the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court is applying. Incentives should be favored over sanctions to the extent possible. That should be what happens. And then guideline 5.2, and here's an example of where we've split out into 2 statements because the research really supported that both of these were important here. So on 5.2 is that participants should feel that the assignment of incentives and sanctions is fair. And to further clarify what we mean here, so first, the application should be consistent. That means participants receive similar incentives and sanctions as others who are in court for the same reasons, but also without violating the principle of consistency that's just described right above it. It's also valuable to individualize incentives and sanctions too. And one of the things that is addressed in the manuscript is that consistency also means that over time, right, kids come to be able to predict the incentives and sanctions based on their behavior and not something that's a moving target, so to speak. Guideline 5.3 looks at the use of financial fees in detention, and the recommendation is that it should be considered only after other graduated sanctions have been attempted. And in particular, detention should be used as a sanction infrequently, only for short periods of time, and only when the youth is in danger to him or herself or the community or may abscond. 5.4 is that the ongoing monitoring and case management of the youth participants should focus less on the detection of violations of program requirements than on addressing their needs in a holistic manner, including a strong focus on behavioral health treatment and family intervention. And so again, that's perhaps a different sort of focus than the way that you're using it now, but the research suggested that kids are more likely to do well, thrive, graduate, stay out of trouble if they're in a program that focuses in that way. Guideline 5.5, a participant's failure to appear for a drug test and otherwise tampering with the drug test results should be addressed with immediate graduated sanctions. Again, the research didn't give us more definition than this, that it should be addressed right away, should be addressed using graduated sanctions that you've already laid out as part of your process. Guideline 5.6, the team should be prepared to respond to any return to substance use in ways that considers the use risks, needs, and responsivity. So again, here, the focus is on individually connecting individually with the young person based on what you know about their risks, needs, and responsivity when you're addressing their return to substance use. All right, objective 6, here's where we focus on the treatment. The objective is to refer participants to evidence-based substance use treatment, to other services, and for pro-social connections. So all of those get addressed here. First guideline, 6.1, is that the JDTC should have access to and use a continuum of evidence-based substance use treatment resources, from inpatient residential treatment to outpatient services, that you really want to have that full continuum represented in the local resources that you have available to you. And then in number 6.2, that the treatment modalities that are administered have been shown to improve outcomes with substance use issues. And we provide you a pretty long list of the evidence-based approaches that came that we were able to sort of provide evidence around from the meta-analysis that the team from Vanderbilt University did as part of our process. And that full report is available on the website. I'll show you where you can get access to that. And then 6.3, service providers should deliver intervention programs with fidelity to the programmatic models. 6.4, that the JDTC should have access to and make appropriate use of evidence-based treatment services that address risks and needs that are identified as priorities in the use case plan. So this goes beyond substance use treatment needs. This would include factors such as trauma, mental health, quality of family life, educational challenges, criminal thinking, any of the other reasons that you would want to access treatment resources. Again, with a focus holistically on the young person and their family. And then guideline 6.5, participants should be encouraged to practice and should receive help in practicing pro-social skills in domains such as work, education, relationships, community health, and creative activities. An area that should not be ignored in your process. And then we get to the final objective, which is objective 7, monitoring and tracking program completion and termination. We've got 3 objectives, 3 guidelines under objective 7, but they're kind of meaty ones. So 7.1, court and treatment practices should facilitate equivalent outcomes. So outcomes like retention, duration of involvement, treatment progress, and positive court outcomes for all program participants, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, or social orientation. So one of the ways that we suggest that you think about this is if you can show with data, what the breakdown at intake is by gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, that's what these other outcomes should look similar to, right? So you want to make sure that in the same proportion that they're coming into your program, they're also experiencing the different outcomes here. And where they're not, that's a sign for you to think more thoughtfully about the way the program is serving those different groups. Guideline 7.2, a use should be terminated from the program only after the team carefully deliberates and only as a last resort after full implementation of the court's protocol on behavioral contingencies. So the research was pretty clear to us that when kids were stayed in the program, were retained in the program, the longer they stayed in, the more likely they were going to complete the program. And that was more important than any particular characteristic about how they were doing in the court. So the guideline we felt that was necessary here just really encourages the team to be really thoughtful here and to think about termination as a last resort. Okay, and then the final guideline, 7.3, is that the JDTC should routinely collect the following detailed data. So, and you'll see these are things that you're tracking, and nothing surprising here because these are all the things we've been talking about from across all the other guideline statements. So things like family-related factors such as family cohesion, home functioning, communication, general recidivism during the program and after completion, drug use during the program, and other alcohol and drug use after the program ends. Program completion and termination, including some of the positive, right? So educational enrollment, sustained employment, and then finally involvement in pro-social activities and youth peer associations as well too. So that's the full set of guidelines for you. I know that's a lot, and this is really just meant to be sort of an introduction. So now we're going to go out to the website So here's the link again. Jen showed you this at the top of the call, and so if you click on that, you should be able to go out to the main website and the landing page that's about to appear. Here we go. So this is where, so if you click on that link, it'll bring you here to this website. And so here's, so there's a little description here, a little bit of narrative that talks about the initiative itself and the guidelines themselves. You'll see the map there. If you were to click on the map, that would open up a bigger a PDF version that you can download. You can print this off. It does print nicely, and so it's just a nice graphical depiction of the full organization of the guidelines. So each of these buttons here are items that you can click, not on the map, but I'll show you where you can get to. So if you look at the top, so where it says Juvenile Drug Treatment Court Guidelines, the blue text there, so that if you click there, that's going to open up the main. So this is the full manuscript. So if you just want to read the full set of guidelines, so this is that publication. Now this publication doesn't exist in print form at this point. It's just a web document, but you can download this document. It's as a PDF. You can print it yourself, carry it around on a device too. So, but the full set of guidelines appears here, and you'll see there's all the annotation about the evidence where that came from. There's a full set of references also appear. So let's go back to the landing page. So this is set up here. So if you look at the objectives here, you can click on any one of those and it opens up this space. So if you just click on any of the, and so you see now, and I'm under objective 3, these are the 4 guideline statements, and each of those buttons now, you can click on those and will open up just a summary page here. Now, if you go to the full manuscript, there's a lot more content in there, but this is just meant to be something you can view on one screen here. So under guidelines, so it tells you the full guideline statement there. The judge should be consistent when applying program requirements, including incentives and sanctions. There's an overview about what this guideline is really addressing. Then a brief description of the evidence. You'll see there are footnotes there. If you click on any of those superscripts, it'll show you the full citation, and that's a toggle. You can toggle that on and off, if you're interested to go and look at any of the evidence. And then there's a little section there about practice considerations. Again, there's going to be more detail in the full manuscript. And then at the bottom, some additional resources, and those are all hyperlinks. So you can click on any of those, and they'll take you out to those examples that you'll be able to learn more about this guideline statement. And you can navigate through here on your own. You can go back and pick another button. You can click the next guideline, and it'll take you through sequentially. And so this is a way, and so you can travel through here and view all of the individual guidelines here. And so it's meant to be interactive. So we hope that you'll spend time here and have some fun with this. And this is also a quick, easy reference too. If you just wanted to, refresh your memory about what a particular guideline focuses on, this is meant to be a good place to go. So if we go back up in the little narrative section there, so where it says supporting information there, so that if you click on that link, that'll take you to a series of documents. So these are all of the research reports that our team put together prior to the actual development of the guidelines. So those are the original sources of material, and so those are the full reports. Again, there's documents that are posted at the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, and you can download those. You read them online. You'll see just under that list there is the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court Guidelines, Research, Evidence, and Practice. That's the protocol document that Jen was talking to you about, this really is the best place to look if you wanted to really understand the process, right? So this gives you details about what's the process we followed, and we put this together in advance of developing the guidelines. So we established the process first, and then pretty much stuck with it throughout the process. Also, just of interest to you, so at the back of this document are two appendices. One, it's also a place where there's a full list of all the contributors, all the people that were involved. But so Appendix A here, so we've mentioned a couple times that there was a certain standard of evidence that the research had to meet in order to become a guideline statement. So this just shows you all in one summary table what standard each of the guideline statements met. So it's a table of all the guideline statements, and then the right-hand column there is the different credibility of ratings. And then the last thing that appears in this document, so we started with the set of 6 reports that I showed you on the list, and look to build the guidelines. Along the way, within the review process, there were some other suggested guidelines that were brought up that weren't supported specifically from the research that we had put together ourselves. So we did allow that if we could find a systematic review or a meta-analysis, which provided evidence to support the guideline statement, then that could also be the basis for the establishment of a guideline statement. So these are other targeted supplemental research reviews that we accessed when our own research was silent on a particular issue that folks out in the field had brought up to us. So those are all here as well. And these are all reports that generally are available online, that you'll be able to, if you wanted to just learn more, those are available to you. All right, so I think that's all that I wanted to show you there. So I think we're gonna stop now and take some questions too before we get into the final phase of the webinar.
So Jessica, are you back on, and are there any questions in the Q&A?
Yes, I am on, and I have a lot of questions. So one of the things that first came up for folks was around why you would select some research and not other research for inclusion. And in particular, we have some really solid research around drug testing with adults. And why were those same standards just not kind of copied over to the guidelines?
Okay, that's a great question. So we were looking at research on juvenile drug court participants. So we did not expand the research base to include research that only spoke to adult offenders, but not juvenile offenders. So that was an intentional part of our design. And again, I think we went into this, really sort of paying attention to the different needs of adolescents, the different capacity of adolescents compared to adults too. So we did want to see that research on juvenile drug treatment courts provided evidence here. And the standards that we set for the research had to do with just research that the quality of the research was such that we had more confidence in the findings. So there is research that gets published or is available online that does not meet some of those standards that were set in each of the systematic reviews. So that there were standards for the research in each of the systematic reviews that our team really followed. And so there's an extensive base of research that we looked at, but there would be some studies that would not meet the standards to be in those reviews. So I invite you to take a look at the reports. They go into more detail than I'm going to do right now about what those requirements were for the different studies.
And Roger, and this is Jen, if I can just supplement, I think, too, and I mean, part of what I think Roger is highlighting here, I introduced at the beginning was sort of one of the fundamental differences between, the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court guidelines that are developed in the sort of adult model is the adolescent, right? And there's developmental differences. And so that commitment to sort of look at where there had been specific research on youth and youth outcomes was an underlying sort of important principle, because the sort of, the youth brain as well as the abilities are sort of for that social, cognitive, emotional ability and outcomes are very different with youth. And so while that adult drug testing, sort of literature is great, that specific question of frequency, which might speak to sort of a person's cognitive ability and sort of, anticipation or social, emotional, there's aspects of it that would be different with juveniles. And so that was a sort of just a foundational principle for the whole document, that adolescents are different than adults. And so that literature, while it expanded beyond just juvenile drug treatment courts, it included other youth programming, other court programs, substance use treatment for youth in general. It was all focused on youth outcomes, specifically recognizing those developmental differences.
And the other thing too, I just want to, before we go on to the next question, so I just want to remind folks, so while there may be research out there that shows that, here, this is what standard practice, so, so we could sometimes find research that show that there seems to be a consensus around a particular practice, but if we couldn't connect the practice with the particular outcomes, then we couldn't include it in the guidelines here, right? Because these guidelines are focused on practices which are shown to be connected to the outcomes that we believe are the outcomes that juvenile drug treatment courts should be focused on. So that was another intentional condition of the research, was that there was a connection between the practice and the outcome for it to form the basis of a guideline statement.
Right. I hope that answered a lot of folks' questions about that. I think one of the things I know that we're hoping for is that as we move forward in the testing phase, we'll be able to answer some of those questions a little bit more definitively as well.
And we're committed to that too. And as these questions came up, we really did look. We really did go back out and look and see, can we find, is there research out there that can help it? And so we will be intentional about trying to address some of these gaps.
Great. So I have a couple of other broad questions, and then I have some questions that came in really specifically about different guidelines. So the first broad question is asking about whether or not the guidelines include something that talks about the breakdown of the populations used for those research studies that we used as the basis for the guidelines. So do we have some place where people can kind of go and look and see more about those population groups?
Yes. So there, some of that is going to be in the actual guideline manuscript itself. So that there is a section under each guideline statement that talks about the research evidence and practice considerations. So some of that is addressed there. If you go to the original research reports themselves, more of it's going to be addressed there as well too.
Okay, great. And then one question came in that just said, is it a bad idea? So our research is not indicating that juvenile drug courts are a bad idea necessarily, but that maybe our juvenile drug treatment courts need to be better at adhering to standards. Is that kind of your feeling, Roger?
So we feel like the question about is it a bad idea is not answered yet. And we didn't feel like the research was there. We did, one of our meta-analyses tried to address that question specifically, and our answer was we don't know yet. There's evidence that suggests that juvenile drug treatment courts make a difference, right? That do well. There's a lot of evidence though that suggests that they're not necessarily better than non drug court programs. So we feel like the question isn't answered yet, and we did develop the guidelines from the perspective of that if we're going to have juvenile drug treatment courts, how can we do them to get to organize them so that we have the best chance possible of having good effects. So that's really the framework that we brought to the development of the guidelines.
All right, I think hopefully we do get an answer to that question. And then the other kind of difficult question to answer here, but I think we really should talk about it a little bit, is around racial and ethnic disparities. And what is kind of, and Jen, you might need to jump in here too. What are the guidelines doing to address racial and ethnic disparities, and how can courts use the guidelines to help combat racial and ethnic disparities within their own jurisdictions?
So sure, so I can start and then Roger certainly supplement. I would say there was, and I don't necessarily want to scroll all the way back, but maybe if we just go to this website, you can see that there was, the presentation just went away, but Objective 2 really, is sort of a starting place there in terms of talking about at least equity, and then there's some discussion there in terms of racial and ethnic disparities, along with, gender and sexual orientation, as Roger noted. And so that was a deliberate inclusion in the guidelines in terms of, talking about disparity in terms of, this is guidelines, what you should be aiming to do, and what you're aiming to do is equitable treatment here. And so this is focused on equity. And then that is reflected, while it's introduced here, it is reflected throughout each of the objectives, and highlighted, for example, in the monitoring, and Roger highlighted that a little bit. And so I think that was a deliberate part of the guidelines. Now, I'm not saying that I think there is certainly more work to be done here, and it's not, recognizing disparity has been sort of work that's been going on for years throughout the juvenile court system, and I don't think the guidelines are going to solve that, but there was a deliberateness of inclusion and a deliberateness of sort of responding to that. Roger, do you have anything else to add to that?
Not really. I think, again, I don't feel like the evidence was there to say this is the way to disparities, right? So I think we didn't have evidence that said if you do this, you won't have disparity. So the best we did at this point, I think, is to build in the principles, right? There should be equity of access, that your practices should be culturally responsive, that, but also that you're monitoring, right? So I think we want courts to, I think the first step here is to start to even look at your own program to see, is there an issue, right? And how bad is it, right? And so I think, and we're also in the testing phase, going to be trying to address that as well. But I think I don't think the research evidence was there to support telling us how to address the disparities yet. We just didn't have that.
I know, though, that this is a priority area for you, right, Jen, at OJJDP?
Yeah, so OJJDP, it's an issue that sort of spans the entire sort of juvenile court. It's included in the guidelines project, but also in sort of a broader discussion of juvenile justice reform. And so, there are some consistencies here that I think sort of fit into that larger conversation, too, about sort of having some of that sort of clear eligibility guidance that sort of, again, is equitable, that there's not sort of those that in some ways this guidance, it's trying to sort of provide that sort of standard around who should be included and why and what the conditions are, and so that there is that sort of, attempt to treat the specific risks and needs of individuals through, again, assessing them with standardized instruments that would and generally validated instruments should be validated on, populations that are racially ethnic diverse, that reflect the local populations. I mean, there's other sort of context in those guidelines that do get to some of those principles. But to Jessica's point, I mean, it's an issue that our office has been working on. I think it's one that we'll continue to work on. It is addressed in here, but I do think there's more work to be done, I mean, frankly, across the juvenile justice system.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And some of the comments I'm seeing coming into the question and answers really is that the field would really like us to make sure that the research that we're looking at to make these decisions really is inclusive of youth of color. A lot of the research, that you think about those courts that were included in like those meta-analyses, didn't necessarily include a lot of kids of color. And so what does that mean for any conclusions we can draw for the guidelines? Well, it probably means that we still have a lot of work to do. And so I think that it's really important for us to continue to have this in the forefront of our conversations and continue to push in that direction. But we need to put a pin in this discussion for now and just answer a couple of more questions, and then we'll finish out the webinar and continue the racial and ethnic disparity conversation over the course of the next couple of years as we move forward with the guidelines. So Roger, I have a couple of questions about very specific guidelines. In Guideline 5.3, detention is mentioned to be used as a last resort, but you don't really talk about the GPS monitoring. Is that because we don't have research, or is there another reason?
There was not a reason that we didn't talk about it. So it's not, we just did not have the research to support that as and that guideline. So I guess my question back to that person is whether you would also include that among practices that should be used very minimally, right? Which is really, that guideline is really focusing on, because there was research that pointed to that families in particular saw the use of fees as being unfair. That parents were often subject, the ones who had to pay the fees that were levied because kids didn't follow the rules, right? They were out of compliance, and so the fees and the detention were the ones that we're suggesting should be used rarely, right? So those are, and so but we did not have the evidence to include the GPS in that. So I guess my question back would be, is that what the person asking the question is wondering, does it also belong in that group? Otherwise, the guidelines are not specific or prescriptive about what your system of graduated sanctions should include, right? I think that would include whatever you've already determined to be your system of graduated sanctions, so that they may very well be an effective component in such a system.
Okay, so on item 3.4, guideline 3.4, should there be a court hearing every week or just a staffing? So how often should court hearings be happening and staffings be happening? Do we have guidance about that?
So the guideline speaks to the weekly staffings. Now that's a good question, because this is tied, so that is tied to, it's not explicit in the guideline statement, but it is connected to the frequency of the court hearings. So in later phases of your process, where a young person comes to court less frequently, the staffings would mirror that level of frequency. But what we were trying to address with that guideline was the research that showed that there were programs where court hearings were happening, but there wasn't also the court or the staffing, right? The staffing was not happening as often as the court. So that oftentimes what was going on in the court hearing was not supported by the enough information from all of the team members that have been working with that young person. That's what we were trying to get at with the guideline statement there.
All right. We have a lot of other questions. There's a lot of kind of speculative questions that are coming in, um, kind of asking, do we know about this yet? And so things like, did the guidelines point to um, uh, any preference between voluntary programs and involuntary programs?
Hmm. Um, yeah, I don't. So that question is not explicitly addressed, but I'm hesitating as I'm answering this because I'm thinking of all the different ways that it would be included, right? So the guidelines talk about the structure of the program, right? It talks about the way that that treatment plans are developed and case management happens, and those are driven by yeah, I think along the way there can be, participants can be compelled within those structures, right? So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think the guidelines do not preclude that there may be aspects that are um, required, but it would be within the context of those, the philosophy of the court, those practices, and the assessments that are done, and then the development of the treatment plans, and the treatment approaches there. So yeah, I hope I answered the question.
And,
I think you
well,
did.
and if I could just supplement, maybe, Roger, there was a sort of, there was a recognition, right, that there are multiple different ways in which juvenile drug treatment courts are implemented. Some are pre-adjudication, some are sort of seen as diversion practices, some are sort of more the formal court process. And so there was an attempt to try and make it as inclusive as possible of the different ways. I mean, there's a reason, and this was part of the discussion, that it's not a specific systemic, individual flowing through the court system in a very specific way to try and be inclusion. And I mean, I think if part of the questions about voluntary and involuntary is sort of informal versus formal processing, then there was at least some sort of attempt to be inclusive of the different types of juvenile drug courts. I will say that diversion is defined a little bit different here in that you could be diverted out of the court system and court supervision altogether. So if it sort of depends, I think, on use of those terms in terms of voluntary and involuntary, but there was an attempt to be as inclusive of the different ways the juvenile drug courts are implemented as possible.
All right. I think we're kind of out of time for questions right now, but what I'm going to encourage folks to do is to attend the other two webinars when we're going to get more in depth in some of these things. Hopefully some of these questions can be answered. We can have more of a debate and conversation about them. I would also suggest to you that if you really do want to have a conversation, that you should feel free to send an email to contact us, and we can get on the phone. We can really talk about some of these things. As the National Council is one of your training and technical assistance providers for the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court field, and I want to make sure that you feel comfortable moving forward in your practice. And so I would encourage you to get in touch with us, and we will do our utmost to help you answer your questions. Roger, why don't you talk about next steps?
Okay, and I'll do this real quickly. So we will. So two things are about to happen here. So we are going to be including in the website a number of briefs that take some of the additional questions that or take some of the guideline statements and go a little bit, so just build in some additional information that we think would be valuable in terms of the translating the guideline for practice. And so it'll be good for me to see the questions that we didn't get to, and I'll make sure that we also try to build those into the discussion in the upcoming webinar. So that's one thing that will happen. The second thing is we're going to do a pretty intensive testing phase. So, and we're going to be looking for courts to be involved in this process too. So we're going to have two different studies. One is going to look at the comparative effectiveness of the JDTC model compared to a standard juvenile court program that would also serve kids with substance use disorders. And so we're going to be, more information is going to be coming soon about how you could apply to be a court that could be in that study. And then we're also going to be doing a larger study with even more courts, more of a survey-based approach that really looks at how and whether the guidelines matter for practice and for outcomes of the juvenile drug treatment courts. And so we're probably the testing phase will probably last for a couple of years, and then we will pull the data all together and revisit whether there's any we can expand on, make changes to the guidelines, and a revised set of guidelines potentially will come out at the end of the initiative. Okay, Jessica, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. So to wrap up, we just wanted to talk about what this means for practice and how you've been operating. A lot of the folks on the webinar have been to our trainings around the 16 strategies, and the question has come up in our question pod: do the guidelines replace the 16 strategies? And I'm going to say yeah, they do. So the core of what you do is going to remain the same. The guidelines do not radically shift how a juvenile drug treatment court operates. But I think it adds quite a lot of nuance, and I think there are some things that you're going to be working to change as a result. So the guidelines and the strategies do share similar goals of providing general guidance and support. They have the same core concepts, or similar core concepts. And that's partly because the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court guidelines and the strategies all still exist within the problem-solving court framework. And if we stray too far from that, then we're going to have to just kind of kick out the words drug court altogether, because then we'll be too far out of what's considered really a problem-solving court. So these core concepts remain intact in the guidelines. And so I think you can think of what you're doing now as being good, and the guidelines are going to help make you better. And the organization is different. When we were talking about racial and ethnic disparities, I think one of the things that I like about the guidelines actually is that equity and procedural justice and fairness and access feels much more prominent to me in the guidelines than it does in the 16 strategies. I've worked with the 16 strategies and with juvenile drug courts since 1998. And so from a theoretical standpoint, I kind of, I feel like what we did with the 16 strategies is that everything's just a list. So cultural competence is one thing on our list, but so is engaging schools, and so is having a strength-based approach. And the strategies didn't necessarily indicate how those things work together, and it didn't necessarily indicate that some things were more important than others. So the fact that we have equity and fairness as kind of a standalone thing within the guidelines, that there's a greater emphasis on using our instruments to drive decision-making and removing some of the subjectivity, should lead to a decrease in racial and ethnic disparities. And so I feel good about that. I'm excited about that. The other thing is that we have things like in the strategies, we just had drug testing as a thing, right? And incentives and sanctions is a thing. And it was really difficult to figure out sort of how to implement and operate those things and how they fit together with everything else. And so the guidelines, though, they say, look, drug testing is just a tool. You're using it to figure out what folks need and inserting services. And that fits under your contingency management and case planning. And so this really, I think, is going to help courts as you're thinking about how things work together and how they fit together. I think the guidelines gives us a nice structure for that. And the research is really important. I don't know how many of you folks on this call I've talked to about this. I think probably a third of you at least. We've had this conversation about, are juvenile treatment drug courts effective? And we know from the research, right? We've been at the NADCP conference when Doug Marlowe has said the evidence isn't there. And that's demoralizing. And so one of the things that I think we should all take away with the guidelines is that this gives us the best chance of operating programs that are going to be effective and that are going to have the outcomes that we want, that are going to allow us to measure what we're doing. And that's going to mean that we're going to be more confident in what's happening in our courts. And I think that's really important because I know that it's a struggle to work with these kids, that we love them, but that they're hard to work with because it's a hard population. And so how can we make sure that we're giving them the very best that we have? And I think the guidelines get us a step closer to that. And we know that some things now are more important, right? The research really is indicating that engaging families, and I would encourage you to define family as broadly as you can. I'm talking caring adults. They don't need to be related by blood, but I want those young people in our programs to have caring adults that'll stand up with them, that'll be there as support, that can help us build that bridge to the community. So we know that engaging families, defined broadly, lead to better outcomes. That's going to be more important than many of the other things that we spend a lot of our time thinking about. That's more important than that McDonald's gift card that we're giving out, right, for an incentive. So thinking about what's most important, the guidelines really help put an emphasis on that. And that target population. I know we talked a lot for a long time about who are those right kids. And our research really is indicating 14 to 17, moderate to high risk, substance use disorder. And, you know, if you don't have the resources in your community to work with those kids, that's a different conversation. But if you can start to target those kids, those are the kids that we've seen the best outcomes from our research. So I really want to leave you with this idea that juvenile drug courts operated like the lion on the left. They were good. They were an outline. They got the job done. You know it's a lion. But with the guidelines, I think we can really, if we move the practice toward the guidelines, we're going to end up with something a little more sophisticated. It's going to look a little more like the lion on the right. It's going to have a depth. It's going to have nuance. It's going to have shading. And we're going to be sure that we're doing what is the closest thing to best practice that we can do. And I think that that is an important takeaway for all of us, is that we want to do right by these kids. We want to do well. Let's get as close to the fancy lion as we can. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Lynetta Jesse to talk about next steps.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for participating on this call today. I know that there are lots of questions and a lot has to do with the implementation of the guidelines. So if you're interested in training and technical assistance, we have included the link for NTAC to request TTA. Just also to give you a little bit more information, we do plan in DOJ's program plan, we do have an FY17 Juvenile Drug Treatment Court program. So keep your eyes open for that. It's not released as of right now, but it will be coming soon. Also, to make sure that if you have not already registered for the series, please do so. There's a lot of information that's being disseminated through these webinars. I think it's most important for you to get every piece of knowledge that you can as we move forward and that questions are answered. So again, thank you for being on the call. Thank you for allowing me to participate, and have a good afternoon.